The audience believed they were watching two legends. They did not realize they were watching a fracture. It was an ordinary night at NBC Studios in Burbank. The lights were as bright as they always were. The band was polished. The applause signs worked perfectly. The rhythm of late-night television flowed with the same practiced confidence it had carried for years. Nothing felt unusual. And yet something was already slightly off. Johnny Carson sat at his desk with his familiar composure. His posture was relaxed but intentional. Every movement he made was measured. His tie sat perfectly centered. His smile, when it appeared, was effortless but never careless. Johnny believed in structure. He believed in preparation. He believed that a show should feel spontaneous but never truly be out of control. Across from him that night sat Dean Martin. Dean leaned back with the comfort of a man who had spent decades charming rooms without appearing to try. His jacket hung loosely. His smile carried that familiar half-amused warmth that made audiences adore him. He held a glass, not because he needed it, but because the glass had become part of the story America believed about him. Dean Martin was the man who didn't take things too seriously. Johnny Carson was the man who took everything seriously, especially the things that looked effortless. That contrast had always worked. For years, their appearances together had been built on that balance. Dean would drift into humor that seemed slightly off script, and Johnny would gently steer the moment back to center. The audience loved the tension between the looseness and the control. It felt alive. But there is a thin line between playful unpredictability and genuine disruption. And on this particular night, that line grew fragile. The interview began normally. Dean entered to thunderous applause. He waved casually, shaking hands, acknowledging the band. Johnny stood, greeted him warmly, and they exchanged that familiar greeting that told the audience, these two men know each other well. They sat. The first few minutes were smooth. Stories about Las Vegas, a light mention of Frank Sinatra, a shared joke about aging in show business. The audience laughed easily. It felt safe. But Johnny noticed something small. Dean was leaning in closer than usual. Not physically aggressive, just closer. The glass in his hand moved a bit more loosely. The gestures were wider. The pauses between lines were longer. Dean's timing, normally disguised beneath the appearance of casual sloppiness, was slightly different tonight. Johnny adjusted. He always adjusted. That was his gift. He read rooms instantly. He could sense when a guest was nervous, overconfident, tired, defensive. He could sense when a joke was about to fail before it left the mouth of the speaker. He could sense when a moment was about to tilt. And tonight something was tilting. Dean told a story about a showgirl in Vegas. It earned laughter, but not the full laughter he expected. He leaned further into the bit. He exaggerated his gestures. The glass tilted slightly, then straightened. Johnny's smile remained, but inside he was calculating. Dean interrupted him mid-sentence, something he rarely did. It was playful, but it landed differently. The audience felt the shift, even if they didn't consciously name it. There was a subtle hesitation in the laughter. Johnny responded with a quick, sharp line. It was clean, controlled, the kind of line that usually reset the rhythm. But Dean didn't reset. He leaned forward again. "John," he said almost lightly, "you worry too much." The audience chuckled. It sounded harmless, teasing. But there was an undercurrent beneath it. Johnny smiled. "That's why I'm still here," he replied. The line should have landed. It should have earned applause. It should have closed the loop. Instead, the room felt suspended. Dean looked at him longer than usual, not in hostility, not exactly, but in something more complicated, a moment of testing. The glass in his hand rose. Slowly. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't explosive. That's what made it uncomfortable. It was almost gentle, casual, deliberate. Johnny did not flinch. That was the moment. Most people would instinctively lean back. Johnny didn't. He held eye contact. The liquid tipped. For a second, it hovered at the rim. Then it fell. It wasn't thrown. It wasn't splashed violently. It poured in a quiet arc that caught the studio lights like something surreal and slow motion. It landed first on Johnny's shoulder, then spread down his jacket in a dark, visible stain. The audience gasped. No one laughed. Not because they were offended. but because they were confused. Was this a bit? Was this rehearsed? Johnny remained still. Perfectly still. He did not brush at his jacket immediately. He did not joke. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Dean. And in that look, something closed. Dean smiled quickly. "Just keeping you awake, pal," he said, trying to redirect the energy. A few nervous laughs scattered through the room. Johnny reached calmly for a napkin. He dabbed his shoulder with slow precision. "We'll take a short break," he said evenly. No anger, no embarrassment, just professionalism. The band played. The cameras cut. But the atmosphere did not reset. During the commercial break, the crew moved in quietly. Towels, a spare jacket, soft whispers, no one spoke loudly, no one joked. Dean stood there with the empty glass in his hand, and for the first time that night, he looked unsure. Johnny changed his jacket without comment. When he returned to his chair, he adjusted it slightly farther from Dean than before. An inch. Just an inch. But it was noticeable. They finished the segment professionally, smoothly, as if nothing significant had happened. The audience eventually returned to laughter. The show flowed on. But something had shifted permanently. After the taping ended, Dean waited in the green room. He expected the usual post-show conversation, the decompression, the casual reflection, the handshake that meant all was well. Johnny did not come. He left through the private exit. No confrontation. No lecture. No visible anger. Just absence. And for a man like Johnny Carson, absence meant everything. Dean went home believing the moment would fade. After all, the show had continued. The audience had laughed again. No headlines exploded the next morning. It seemed small, but Johnny Carson understood something Dean did not. Respect is quiet until it disappears. And once it disappears, it rarely returns in the same form. In the weeks that followed, their public interactions became polite, professional, measured. The warmth was gone. No fight ever occurred, no dramatic argument behind closed doors. Just distance. Johnny invited him less often. Conversations were shorter. The easy camaraderie had turned into formal cooperation. Years later, people would remember that night as that funny moment with the spilled drink. But the people who were there felt something else entirely. They felt the instant the laughter stopped being shared. They felt the subtle line that had been crossed. They felt the shift from friendship to professionalism. And they understood something most audiences never see. In show business, the loudest endings are rarely the ones that matter. The quiet ones are. That night, under hot studio lights and forced applause, two men finished a segment. But somewhere between the pouring glass and the measured silence that followed, a friendship, or at least the illusion of one, quietly ended. The studio audience had gone home believing they had witnessed a strange but harmless moment of live television. By the next morning, the incident was already shrinking into something anecdotal, the kind of thing that could be retold at dinner parties with a laugh and a shake of the head. Viewers who had watched it from their living rooms debated whether it had been planned. Some insisted it must have been. Others felt the tension but could not explain it. But inside the quiet spaces where performance ended and real thought began, the moment did not shrink. It expanded. Johnny Carson drove home that night in silence. He preferred driving himself when he could. It allowed him time to think without interruption. The Los Angeles streets were mostly empty and the city lights blurred past his windshield like distant stars. He replayed the moment not as humiliation but as information. That was how he processed things. He did not immediately assign anger to what happened. He examined it. He dissected it. He measured it against every previous interaction he had ever had with Dean Martin. Johnny had built his entire career on a foundation that few people truly understood. It was not simply humor. It was not simply charm. It was control. Live television was a fragile structure. One unpredictable moment could unravel years of credibility. Johnny had seen careers collapse because someone mistook recklessness for charisma. He had spent decades protecting the environment of his show, not because he was rigid, but because he believed the audience deserved consistency. They trusted him. Every night at the same hour, they invited him into their homes. He owed them steadiness. Dean Martin represented something very different. Dean's brand was looseness. He floated through rooms as though gravity had less hold on him than on others. He joked about being unprepared. He embraced the myth that he didn't take anything seriously. But that was only partly true. Dean worked hard. He rehearsed more than people realized. The glass he carried on stage was a symbol carefully maintained. He understood performance deeply, perhaps just as deeply as Johnny did, but he packaged it differently. He disguised discipline beneath ease. And that night, Johnny believed Dean had blurred the boundary between character and reality in a way that endangered more than a jacket. It was not about the liquid. It was not about embarrassment. It was about intention. Johnny did not mind being the target of a joke. He had built entire segments around self-deprecation, but what unsettled him was that Dean had pushed the moment beyond rehearsal without warning. He had introduced real uncertainty into a space that thrived on invisible structure. Dean, meanwhile, sat alone in his living room that same night with the television off and the house unusually quiet. He poured himself a real drink this time, not as a prop, but as comfort. He told himself it had been nothing, a harmless gesture, a playful moment. That was what he had always done, pushed slightly further than expected, then relied on charm to smooth it over. For years, that approach had worked. Audiences loved the spontaneity. Producers appreciated the ratings. He had rarely encountered consequences. But beneath his outward calm, there was unease. Dean understood people, he understood timing, and in Johnny's stillness, in that complete absence of reaction, he had sensed something unfamiliar. Johnny had not laughed, he had not scolded, he had not turned it into a joke. He had simply withdrawn. That withdrawal was subtle, but it was absolute. In the days that followed, their teams communicated the way they always had. There were no formal complaints, no angry phone calls, no demands for apology. Schedules continued, but something intangible had shifted. Johnny's producers quietly noted that Dean would not be booked again for a while. It was presented as normal rotation, nothing unusual. But in the unspoken language of television, it meant distance. Johnny believed in distance when trust was unsettled. He did not believe in dramatic confrontations. He had witnessed enough public feuds in Hollywood to know they solved nothing. Instead, he practiced something quieter. If a boundary was crossed, he reduced access. Invitations became less frequent. Conversations became more formal. Warmth became measured. It was not revenge. It was recalibration. Dean noticed. At first, he brushed it aside. He was busy. He had shows, recordings, film appearances. He told stories about the incident in other interviews, always framing it as playful. He laughed easily when recounting it. Interviewers laughed too, unsure whether they were missing something deeper. But each time he told it, he felt the gap widen slightly. Johnny never referenced the moment publicly. That silence felt heavier than criticism would have. Months passed. They crossed paths at industry events, award shows, charity functions. When they greeted each other, the exchange was polite and friendly enough for cameras. But the spontaneity was gone. The subtle ease they once shared had hardened into professionalism. Conversations remained surface level. There were no more extended private talks after tapings. No more lingering in dressing rooms to decompress and share stories away from microphones. For Johnny, the issue was not ego. It was alignment. He believed that when two performers shared a stage, they shared responsibility. Trust allowed them to take risks together, but that trust required understanding limits. The spilled drink had been less about humor and more about testing. Johnny sensed that Dean had tested whether the rules applied equally to him. Johnny's quiet answer had been that they did. Dean, on the other hand, wrestled with a different realization. He had built a career on being the man who didn't care, but he did care. He cared about respect. He cared about loyalty, and in Johnny's withdrawal, he felt something unexpected: loss. He had not intended to damage anything. In his mind, the moment had been a flourish, an extension of the character audiences loved. But characters live in controlled environments. Real relationships require something steadier. The entertainment industry thrives on exaggerated conflict. Public spats sell headlines, but the deeper fractures rarely make news. They unfold in silence. They show up in who is not invited, in who is not called, in who is absent when milestones occur. Years later, when Johnny prepared for major career moments, certain names were present, others were not. Absence speaks loudly in Hollywood. What made the situation particularly complex was that neither man publicly acknowledged tension. They both maintained dignity. They both spoke respectfully of each other when asked. That mutual restraint prevented scandal, but it also prevented repair. Without conversation, misunderstanding solidified. Without apology, assumptions grew roots. Johnny believed that apologies must be voluntary. He did not request one. He did not demand explanation. He simply observed behavior and adjusted accordingly. Dean, perhaps prideful, perhaps uncertain how to address something that had not been openly criticized, never initiated a direct conversation about it. Each man waited for the other to bridge the distance. Neither did. The cost of control is often isolation. Johnny's mastery of composure protected his show, but it also limited vulnerability. He rarely allowed people to see disappointment. He rarely allowed himself to appear wounded. And so even if he felt hurt that night, he processed it privately and moved forward without discussion. The cost of charm can be misunderstanding. Dean's easy persona made it difficult for people to distinguish between calculated performance and genuine carelessness. In trying to maintain his image of effortlessness, he may have underestimated the seriousness with which Johnny approached shared space. As time continued, their careers evolved. The industry changed. New comedians emerged. Television formats shifted. But that moment remained like a quiet footnote in the history between them, not dramatic enough for documentaries, not explosive enough for biographies to dwell upon extensively, yet significant enough that those who were close to the situation understood its weight. Respect, once altered, rarely returns in its original shape. It can be rebuilt, but it requires acknowledgement. In the absence of conversation, silence becomes structure. That is what happened between Johnny Carson and Dean Martin. Silence became their new architecture. The audience never saw it fully. They saw professionalism. They saw polite collaboration. They saw two icons who appeared to coexist peacefully in the same era. What they did not see was the inch of distance that remained between them long after the studio lights dimmed. And sometimes that inch is everything. Time has a quiet way of revealing what pride tries to hide. Years passed after that night in Studio One, and on the surface, nothing dramatic ever happened between Johnny Carson and Dean Martin. There were no public feuds, no headlines screaming betrayal, no televised arguments. Their names continued to appear in the same conversations about late-night television and classic American entertainment. They were still mentioned together as icons of an era that seemed, in retrospect, golden and unrepeatable. But beneath the polished narrative of Hollywood history, the distance remained intact, subtle yet permanent. As the years moved forward, Johnny's show continued to dominate the late-night landscape. He refined his craft even further, becoming more selective with guests, more protective of the rhythm he had perfected. The show had always been about more than laughs. It was about reliability. Viewers trusted Johnny because he never seemed out of balance. Even when he took risks, they felt calculated. That trust became sacred to him. Every guest who sat across from him entered a space governed by invisible agreements. Humor could stretch boundaries, but it could not erode the structure itself. The spilled drink had not broken the show, but it had reminded Johnny how fragile that structure truly was. Dean's career followed a different trajectory. He leaned deeper into his image of relaxed irreverence. His performances remained smooth, his voice warm and familiar, his presence effortlessly magnetic. Audiences continued to adore him, and he continued to deliver exactly what they expected. Yet as entertainment evolved and new styles emerged, the old rhythms began to feel nostalgic rather than current. The world was changing, and the kind of looseness that once felt charming now sometimes felt like a relic of another time. Dean adjusted as best he could, but the myth of carefree detachment became harder to maintain in a culture that was becoming more self-aware. They encountered each other occasionally at industry events. Award ceremonies placed them at neighboring tables. Charity galas paired them in photographs that captured polished smiles and firm handshakes. Cameras flashed and articles described the warm reunion of two legends, but the warmth was curated. It lived in public gestures, not in private conversation. When the cameras turned away, they did not linger together. Their exchanges were brief, respectful, and contained. There were no extended dinners. No shared confidences about aging, no reflections on the early years when both men had been climbing toward recognition. Johnny, as he approached the later phase of his career, became increasingly reflective. Hosting a show for decades forces a person to measure time differently. Each anniversary marked not just longevity, but endurance. He had watched comedians rise and fall. He had watched trends transform. He had weathered criticism and praise in equal measure. What remained constant was his insistence on control. It had protected him from chaos, but it had also narrowed his emotional access to others. He trusted few people completely. and once trust was shaken, he rarely rebuilt it. Dean experienced his own form of reflection, though it manifested differently. His persona of nonchalance sometimes masked a deeper sensitivity. He valued loyalty and camaraderie, even if he rarely articulated it. In quiet moments, he thought about that night more often than he admitted publicly. He replayed it not as a triumph of spontaneity, but as a turning point. He recognized, slowly and perhaps reluctantly, that what he had framed as humor might have felt like disregard. Pride prevented him from initiating a direct conversation. He told himself that if Johnny truly had a problem, he would say so, but Johnny never did. The absence grew most noticeable during significant milestones. When Johnny prepared for major career celebrations, the guest lists were scrutinized by journalists and insiders alike. Certain names were expected, certain appearances were symbolic, and sometimes the name of Dean Martin was not there. Official explanations always existed: scheduling conflicts, health considerations, production logistics. None of them were false, but none of them captured the full truth either. The absence did not begin with logistics. It began with that inch of distance that had never closed. What made the situation particularly poignant was that neither man seemed to carry visible resentment. There was no bitterness in interviews. When asked about one another, both spoke respectfully. They praised each other's talent. They acknowledged each other's contributions to entertainment history. Their words were genuine, but sincerity in public statements does not automatically restore private ease. Professional respect is not the same as personal trust. As Johnny approached retirement, the weight of legacy grew heavier. Final shows are rarely just broadcasts, they are cultural moments. They gather the past into a single frame. Invitations become symbolic gestures of gratitude. When certain figures are present, their presence communicates reconciliation and continuity. When others are absent, their absence speaks softly but persistently. Observers noticed who stood on that final stage and who did not. They speculated quietly. Some understood the history, others saw only coincidence. Dean, watching from a distance, felt something difficult to name. It was not anger, it was not even regret in the conventional sense. It was awareness. He understood that some doors, once gently closed, remain closed not because of hostility, but because of inertia. Years of polite distance accumulate like layers of dust. Eventually, the effort required to clear them feels too large for aging hands. Johnny, too, felt the passage of time differently as he stepped away from the nightly ritual that had defined him. Without the structure of a daily broadcast, reflection becomes unavoidable. He thought about the people who had shaped his career. He thought about the risks he had taken and the risks he had avoided. He thought about moments that had tested his boundaries. That night with Dean was one of them, not because it was catastrophic, but because it forced him to reaffirm who he was and what he valued. He did not view his reaction as punishment. He viewed it as consistency. If he allowed certain boundaries to blur for one person, he would have to allow them to blur for others. And he believed that fairness required uniformity, yet consistency can sometimes come at the expense of grace. In choosing steadiness, he may have sacrificed the possibility of repair. As both men aged, health began to shape their schedules more than ambition. Appearances became fewer, travel required more effort, public life gradually narrowed. In those quieter years, the memory of youthful bravado softened. The things that once felt urgent began to feel small. The spilled drink, once a sharp line dividing before and after, became a symbol rather than an injury. It symbolized a difference in philosophy. It symbolized the tension between looseness and structure, between improvisation and order. People often imagine that dramatic conflicts end with dramatic reconciliations, but many relationships do not end with final conversations. They taper, they fade, they become stories that could have been rewritten but were not. Johnny Carson and Dean Martin never publicly resolved that night because there was no official dispute to resolve. There was only a subtle shift that neither man reversed. When Dean eventually reflected on his career in interviews, he often emphasized the joy of performance, the friendships forged in shared stages, the laughter that carried him through decades. When Johnny reflected, he spoke about discipline, preparation, and the craft of hosting. Their perspectives were not contradictory, but they highlighted the difference that had always existed between them. That difference had once created chemistry. Later, it created separation. In the end, what remains most powerful is not the spilled drink itself, but the silence that followed it. Silence can be dignified, it can be controlled, it can be strategic, but it can also solidify distance. Neither man publicly criticized the other. Neither man sought to exploit the moment for publicity. That restraint speaks to their professionalism and mutual respect. Yet professionalism sometimes replaces intimacy rather than preserving it. The absence at the end was not dramatic enough for headlines, but it was meaningful enough for those who watched closely. It served as a reminder that respect is maintained not only through talent but through attention. Humor thrives on trust. Once that trust is unsettled, even slightly, it changes the texture of every shared moment thereafter. By the time the curtain fell on their era, the world remembered them as giants. And they were. Their contributions to American entertainment were undeniable. But within the story of those contributions lies a quieter lesson about boundaries, pride, and the delicate balance between persona and person. That lesson was never spoken directly on camera. It lived in glances, in inches of space, and in the absence of a name on a final guest list. Some friendships do not explode, they erode. Some endings are not marked by confrontation, but by gradual withdrawal. The night the laughter stopped was not the night their careers changed. It was the night their closeness did. And as time moved forward, that inch of distance proved more durable than either man might have expected. In the end, what people remember is rarely the argument. They remember the tone. They remember the feeling in the room. They remember whether laughter felt shared or strained. And when history settles, it is not the spilled drink that carries weight, but the stillness that followed it. As the years distanced that night from the present, both Johnny Carson and Dean Martin became less like men in motion and more like monuments. Their names were spoken with reverence, clips replayed on television specials. Younger comedians studied Johnny's timing the way musicians study classical compositions. Singers tried to capture the relaxed warmth in Dean's voice. The world preserved their performances, but it could not preserve their private spaces. Silence, when chosen, becomes part of a person's legacy. Johnny had chosen silence, not dramatic silence, not bitter silence, but disciplined silence. He never told the story publicly from his perspective. He never mocked it. He never corrected it when others framed it as harmless fun. He simply declined to give it more energy than it deserved. To him, the moment had been instructive, not explosive. It revealed something about boundaries. It clarified something about respect. And once clarified, he adjusted accordingly. Dean, too, carried silence, but of a different kind. His silence was layered with pride and perhaps with uncertainty. He continued to tell stories about spontaneity, about live television unpredictability, about the way audiences loved chaos when it was charming. But deep down, he understood that charm depends on consent. A joke works when both people are inside it. The moment consent is questioned, humor shifts. Dean had spent his life walking right up to that line and dancing on it gracefully. That night, perhaps for the first time, he stepped slightly past it. What makes their story enduring is not scandal, but humanity. Neither man was a villain. Neither man was fragile. Both were seasoned professionals who understood the demands of performance. But even seasoned professionals are human, and humans miscalculate. The difference between a lasting bond and a lasting distance often lies in whether someone chooses to address the miscalculation directly. Johnny believed in structure. Structure requires rules. Rules create fairness. Fairness builds trust. From his perspective, letting that moment pass without consequence would have eroded the very structure he protected. His choice to quietly reduce access was consistent with who he had always been. It was not punishment, it was alignment. Yet alignment can feel cold to those on the receiving end. Dean believed in fluidity. Fluidity allows improvisation. Improvisation creates magic. Magic builds connection. From his perspective, the moment had been an extension of the shared language they had built over years. He may have assumed that their familiarity could absorb it. When it did not, he faced something uncomfortable, the realization that familiarity does not erase limits. As both men aged, the entertainment world transformed around them. Television grew louder, faster, more sensational. Moments that once would have felt shocking became commonplace. Hosts pushed boundaries openly. Guests courted controversy intentionally. In that changing landscape, the incident between Johnny and Dean seemed almost quaint by comparison. But its emotional significance did not depend on scale. It depended on relationship. Toward the later chapters of their lives, time narrowed the circle of what truly mattered. Health became fragile. Friends from earlier decades passed away. The audience that had once tuned in nightly grew older too. In quieter hours, reflection deepens. Success becomes less urgent than peace. Pride becomes less satisfying than understanding. It is impossible to know the exact thoughts each man carried privately, but it is reasonable to believe that perspective shifted with age. There's a quiet sadness in knowing that some relationships drift not because of cruelty, but because of restraint. Had one of them called the other years later and said plainly, That night stayed with me. Perhaps the distance might have softened, but neither man was inclined toward emotional confession. They came from generations that valued composure over vulnerability. They communicated through timing and gesture, not through open confrontation. Their story offers something more meaningful than gossip. It offers a lesson about the cost of pride and the cost of silence. Pride protects dignity, but it can also prevent repair. Silence preserves professionalism, but it can also solidify separation. In high-pressure environments like live television, where personas blend with personal identity, even small moments can echo far beyond their immediate context. The audience often believes that friendship between public figures mirrors what they see on screen. But on-screen chemistry is a crafted experience. It requires rehearsal, understanding, and mutual awareness of boundaries. When those boundaries are unintentionally crossed, the rupture may not explode dramatically. Instead, it may recede quietly into distance. Johnny Carson's legacy is one of precision, steadiness, and disciplined excellence. Dean Martin's legacy is one of warmth, charm, and effortless style. Those legacies coexist comfortably in cultural memory, yet within their intersection lies a reminder that even legends navigate fragile human territory. Fame does not eliminate the need for respect. Experience does not eliminate the possibility of misjudgment. The final lesson may not be about who was right or wrong. It may be about awareness. Humor is powerful because it disarms tension, but it must be shared intentionally. Control is powerful because it prevents chaos, but it must be tempered with openness. Somewhere between looseness and rigidity lies balance. That balance is what allows relationships to endure. When people look back on their story now, they may focus on nostalgia, on black and white clips and familiar laughter. But if they look deeper, they might see something quieter and more instructive. They might see two men who excelled at performance but struggled, like many of us, with direct communication when feelings were involved. They might see how easily an assumption can replace a conversation. They might recognize how silence can become permanent simply because no one interrupts it. In the end, the stage was cleared, the studio lights cooled, and the audience moved on to new eras of entertainment. But the space between Johnny Carson and Dean Martin remained a quiet testament to the complexity of friendship under pressure. Their lives remind us that success does not guarantee emotional clarity, that talent does not shield us from misunderstanding, and that sometimes the most important words are the ones never spoken. What the silence teaches is simple yet profound. Respect must be mutual, boundaries must be honored, and when something feels unsettled, conversation is braver than withdrawal. The laughter that night may have returned before the show ended, but the ease between them did not. And perhaps that is the deeper story, not about a spilled drink, but about the fragile architecture of trust. The world will always remember them as icons, but within that iconography lies a human truth. Even legends must navigate the delicate balance between performance and personhood. And sometimes, the most lasting impact of a single moment is not the spectacle itself, but the quiet space it creates afterward. That quiet space became their final shared language.